Everyday injustice. Too many wrongful convictions. Corruption has infected the criminal justice system, leaving too many people helpless, fighting for their lives. Instead of receiving justice, people suffer. Is that why they say justice is blind?
Today on Everyday Injustice, we're going to be talking about bail policy in California. We're talking with Johanna Lacoe from the California Policy Lab. She's rejoining the program. Welcome back.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So what have we learned about bail this year?
Oh boy, well, we've learned a lot of things about bail, I'd say, over the last couple of years. It's an interesting time to be doing research on bail in California because California has tried out a lot of different things over the past couple of years that allow us to learn about how bail works. Would it help to back up and talk a little bit about what bail is?
Yeah, and maybe also describe the changes to bail under Humphrey.
Sure, happy to do that. So under the traditional bail system following an arrest, but before a determination has been made in a case, judges have to decide whether to detain someone in jail or release them while they wait for trial. And cash bail has long been a tool that judges use to ensure that people return to court. The person pays the bail amount, which is set by the judge, often based on a bail schedule. And if they fail to appear in court, they don't get their money back. So it's a way to kind of ensure that people show up for court. But there have been a lot of criticisms of the cash bail system and that it leads to the detention of people purely based on their inability to pay that initial bail amount. And not based on their risk of failing to appear for court or, committing another crime. So as a result, there have been a lot of challenges to the traditional bail system, and the Humphrey case is one. In the Humphrey case, there was a challenge it was a case that occurred in San Francisco, and Mr. Humphrey was arrested on a set of charges, and then the judge posted a pretty high bail amount for Mr. Humphrey to remain, out of jail during the pretrial period, and he was unable to pay that amount. So later on down the line, his attorneys decided to challenge that initial decision to detain him because of his inability to pay a bail, saying that the bail was set at a level that he was never going to be able to pay, right? He didn't even have the chance of being able to pay that. So, and the broader point that they're making is that the bail amounts that were set in San Francisco County were based on this county bail schedule, were often at levels that were unaffordable to many people in custody. So it wasn't just Mr. Humphrey, but this was happening in kind of a broader way, and disproportionately then detaining people based on their ability to pay, based on their income level. So the Humphrey decision requires courts in the county to consider a defendant's ability to pay when setting that bail amount. So don't just rely on the bail schedule, but really consider, someone's income, where their income is coming from, how they're able to pay and the amount that they're able to pay when setting that amount. And instead of just setting it really high and de facto detaining people. If a judge wants to detain someone, they need to just detain them and not do it by setting a high bail amount. The Humphrey decision also required that judges consider the least restrictive option when making this decision for people. And there in San Francisco, we can talk about there are a bunch of different options, but this often means that instead of detaining someone, releasing them on a pretrial supervision program where they have a caseworker and they have someone following up with them, but allows them to stay in the community.
So, it's really interesting because I think anecdotally, at least, having been in courtrooms across the state, I don't think judges are following Humphrey. They're certainly not going with the least restrictive option. And it seems pretty easy for them to make a special finding in which they determine that there's a public safety risk, even if it's not something that you would normally think of as a public safety. Like I watched one where the guy was vandalized, or accused of vandalizing, the outside of buildings, and they found that to be a public safety risk, which didn't seem to be in line with what the judges in Humphrey really were going after.
Yeah, I think there are a couple of things at play here that are super interesting and that we are planning to study moving forward to the extent that we can. But is what does the Humphrey decision look like in its statewide rollout? So the paper that we published is just about San Francisco, which started to adhere to Humphrey earlier than everyone else as the case was making its way through the state Supreme Court system. But now it's in place for the entire state. And there are a couple of issues with it. One is that no one has spelled out how judges are supposed to take into consideration ability to pay in the moment in the courtroom, what information needs to be provided, how that should be provided. That information isn't documented. So for researchers, it's really hard to know, did they take into consideration ability to pay, and what did that look like, and what was the person's ability to pay? If you've been in a courtroom, you know that these things move really fast. They're moving a bunch of different matters forward very quickly. And so the idea that the attorneys are able to figure out someone's ability to pay and present it to the judge in an effective way in that period of time it's a difficult thing. And it hasn't been spelled out how that process should work. So that's one thing. And I think the other thing, when you talk about judges using the least restrictive option, it really depends on, in that county, how many options there are. And not every county has a really robust pretrial services system with, graduated set of options that judges can choose from. So if you're faced with release on own recognizance and detention as your two options, and maybe that's too simplistic an option, maybe judges err towards the side of detention because they don't feel like own recognizance release is going to be right for that person. So I agree, there have been very few guidelines set to kind of instruct judges and counties about how to comply with the Humphrey decision. And that's generating a lot of variation across the state in how it's being implemented, and to the extent that it is being implemented at all.
So what did your study focus on?
So our San Francisco study compared people who were released before and after the Humphrey decision in San Francisco. So we do some pretty basic things at the beginning. We just want to know, did the pretrial detention rate change before and after the Humphrey decision? Do we see the kind of on aggregate, the decision-making changing about how to release people pretrial? And we did find that following the Humphrey decision, pretrial detention fell by 11%. We also found that people who were released during that pretrial period were less likely to be convicted in the post-Humphrey period. So this decline in conviction rates, we find, is primarily driven by a reduction in the likelihood of plea bargaining. So if people are facing a lower likelihood of detention, then they're less likely to agree to a plea that they didn't want to agree to in the first place. So those are some basic big picture statistics. And then we do a little bit more in the paper to try to compare people who were released post period to very similar people in the pre-period before the Humphrey decision, and really try to see if we see the same thing, and we do. Our results are really consistent. And then I guess the final important point from the paper was that we look at whether people are detained, we look at whether they're convicted in that case, and whether that conviction was due to a plea. And then we look at subsequent arrests or convictions, and we find no consistent change in subsequent arrests or convictions in the post-Humphrey period, no matter how we look at it. And this leads us to determine that we see, a small increase in pretrial release and no change in recidivism as a result.
And you also looked in a paper that came out in late August at the short-term impacts of bail policy on crime in Los Angeles. Did you find similar things there?
Yeah, Los Angeles is a really interesting context to consider bail policy because they've kind of turned bail reform on and off several times over a multi-year period. So for researchers, that's an exciting opportunity to see, okay, what, not only when reforms go into place, what changes, but when reforms are taken away, what changes. Those are both really important contexts to understand. So since March 2020, Los Angeles County has had these several distinct shifts in bail policy. So during the COVID-19 pandemic, they implemented an emergency bail schedule for most misdemeanors and low-level felonies that's sometimes called zero bail. So that means that for these lower level offenses, a bail amount of $0 was set. And this during the COVID pandemic in LA and then statewide was meant to control jail populations and reduce the spread of COVID, of course. Then in July 2022, LA County returned to their normal bail schedule. So it went back to kind of the status quo bail schedule where a person who's arrested, they could pay the amount specified by the bail schedule and immediately be released before that first court date. And then in May 2023, there was a successful court challenge to bail practice along a lot of the same tenets as Humphrey, but framed in kind of a different way. And this successful court challenge caused the Los Angeles Police and Sheriff's Department, not countywide, but just the police and sheriff's departments, to return to the emergency bail schedule. So again, we had, the normal bail schedule and then went back to kind of the zero bail, if you will, scenario. And this was followed pretty shortly afterwards by this countywide implementation of a new, more permanent pretrial release system. So not just the emergency bail schedule, but kind of a more thought out release system called the pre-arraignment release protocols. And that was in October 2023. And this still has similar elements where no monetary bail is set for people arrested for these certain lower level offenses. Again, it's not for everything, it's just for lower level offenses. And for some offenses, judges are able to consider additional information like criminal history, previous failures to appear for court, and risk assessments when making their release decision. So it tried to build out kind of a more robust set of information that judges are using when making that release decision.
And are you seeing a large scale impact on crime as these changes are going through the system?
I mean, I think the big picture answer is no. There are a couple of caveats, of course. We do see changes in the average daily jail population. So we see that these decisions are, changing the number of people in the jail. But we aren't seeing short-term effects on citywide crime for the most part. And again, we're comparing the 2 months before each policy change to the 2 months after. That's largely because we wanted to do this quickly as the changes were happening and get some information out there, but also because the changes are happening in such quick succession that we have to kind of keep the pre and post period separate. So I can walk through kind of the top line takeaways, but we found that first policy change where they removed the COVID emergency bail schedule and reverted back to cash bail as we knew it before, we found that the average daily jail populations increased, right? More people were held in jail, as you would expect, and there were no short-term effects on citywide crime in any of the types of crime we looked at. We found when the emergency bail schedule was reinstated, we didn't see a change in the average daily jail population or in citywide crime in the following 2 months, but we do see a slight increase in property crime. And it's interesting because property crime had been declining in the previous 2 months prior to the policy change. And what we found is that decline did not continue at the same rate as it did before. It flattened out a little bit. And
what do you make of that?
Yeah, it's hard to know. We spent a lot of time digging and looking to make sure that was right. Seasonality is a big issue in crime trends, and it's hard to control for in this study because we're looking at these 2-month windows. And as crime that changes in the summer, it goes down in the winter. There are these seasonal patterns. So we looked at previous years over the same period of time to make sure that what we were picking up wasn't just a seasonal change. We don't believe that that's the case. We do believe that this 2023 change was unique. And So we don't have a good answer for why property crime seems to have ticked up a little bit during that period of time. Again, we didn't see a change in the daily jail population. And we didn't see an overall change in total crime reports or arrests, just this small deviation from the previous declining trend in property crime. And then the next change was this more permanent system. And we found after the implementation of PARP, there was a decrease in the daily overall pretrial county jail populations and no effect on citywide crime. And that was just in the 2 months following that program. And I think it would behoove us to look what happens a year out, 2 years out from the implementation to really get a better sense of the longer term effects of this system. But in that short-term period, we did not see a change in overall crime.
It seems to me, as somebody who actually has a background in methodology for when I went to graduate school, that bail effects are probably pretty difficult to kind of tease out because there are so many countervailing impacts of what's going on. You got to figure out the overall trends, and then you got to figure out, the baseline. And, one of the problems with zero bail and trying to assess that was you're in the middle of a pandemic. So you have all these like massive impacts. Is the bail really one of those impacts that's causing you to see differences? The other problem, I think, is kind of endemic to bail itself, is that it's a strange system. On the one hand, you would think, okay, well, if we incarcerate more people, that's going to make crime go down because obviously there's going to be less chances. But there's all this research that suggests that that may not be the case, that if you end up, in custody pre-trial, then you have all these issues that come up because you disrupt people's lives. So they lose their job, they lose their family, they lose their place of living. And so it may be once they get out, they're more likely to commit another crime because you've basically taken away stuff without, helping them to get back on their feet. So that's a problem. And then there's that basic fairness, which you talked about earlier, the fact that, hey, if I'm rich, I can pay my way out, even if I may be a risk to the public. And nobody seems to take that into account, right? Because like, if you're a millionaire and you're committing a bunch of crimes, why is it that being a millionaire is going to stop you from committing another crime?
Yeah, very true. I mean, I think this brings up a lot of issues that are interesting about bail policy. One, our San Francisco study is looking at individual level effects. So what happens to that person who's arrested, and are they convicted and rearrested in that case? And that's a very kind of micro look at what happens when bail policy changes to an individual involved in the system already. And there you can think about, are there incapacitation effects? Are there these like the effects that I would call like cumulative effects of contact with the justice system, where if you appear in front of the judge, coming straight from the jail, that is a very different look than when you walk in off the street in your street clothes coming from work. And that sends messages to the judges, no matter how much they try to set them aside, about your ability to, desist from future criminal activity or to remain safe in the community. So that's why we're really interested in looking at that initial bail decision or that initial detention decision and whether it has downstream effects even on your conviction, your probability of conviction in the current case. And obviously having a conviction on your record then has downstream effects for you for the rest of your life, employment, housing, overall stability of your life. But then in the LA paper, we were really trying to zoom out and say, okay, let's put the individual effects aside and ask what is the broader overall effect? Because we were hearing a lot of people say bail reform is going to increase crime. And when people are talking about, they're talking about both this broader incapacitation effect, like if we just incarcerate people, then they can't be on the street committing crimes, right? But also a deterrent effect, which is saying if people know that the consequences for their behavior are less, then they're more likely to commit crime at all, right? So this kind of message that there's this crime generating process going on when you reform the bail system. And we really wanted to speak to that in LA. Say, is that actually happening? Because as you said, there are a ton of different things affecting crime rates, especially on a population level and a county level in a place as big as LA. It would be kind of surprising if we saw this change in how we process people at the pretrial stage really ripple out and change crime rates altogether. Now, it might have here and there, but there's also, other changes, other things happening in the community that are affecting crime rates, obviously, at the same time. And we did our best to piece those apart, and that's why we looked at these 2-month windows before and after, so we can try to control for as much of what's going on during that period of time, that short window of time as possible. But the narrower you get, the harder it is to say about the kind of overall broader long-term impact. So those are the trade-offs. But yeah, I think it's totally true. And we're trying to put these pieces of real evidence out there so that when policymakers are considering making changes, then they can have kind of a right-sized understanding of what the response of the whole community might be and what the response of individuals, working through the system might be.
And I think that's my basic level of frustration as somebody who's not only in the media sphere now, but also has the background in methodology, is that it doesn't feel like hard data analysis is driving a lot of these conversations. And it feels like we don't know enough about certain things. Like we assume that if there's a change in the bail policy, that the quote unquote bad guys are going to know this and adjust their behavior. And I don't really get the sense that that's true.
Yeah, some of these policy changes are pretty nuanced. So it's hard to really imagine a situation where everyone who's out there, premeditated, considering committing a crime will weigh the costs and benefits in any, policy moment so effectively, or that's even happening. Another kind of dimension of this that we've heard is that, law enforcement might change as a result of these policy changes. The police might know that if we arrest this person, they're very unlikely to be detained. They're just going to be released again. Why bother, right? So that's why we looked at arrest activity too, as part of our LA study, to just see if there are any changes in arrest activity. We don't see any, so we can't tell any sort of story there. But that's another issue that's been brought up, another factor that, people can commit as much crime as they want to some degree. We're not going to observe that in the criminal justice system if they're not arrested, right? If they're not brought in and processed, we won't even see that observation really in our data. So really, the policing activity and the level of policing, the level of arrest that's happening feeds into kind of what we can see later on in the system.
Yeah, and I think that's an important point because we know from data analysis that there's kind of a low closure rate on a lot of crime. And it makes sense, right? I mean, especially in a place like LA, you can kind of have to balance it out. Okay, I'm going to put my resources more into violent crime, more into murders and homicides than I am going to be to petty theft. I just don't have the resources to be able to do that. So that would seem to be a bigger factor. And it would also not be sensitive to changes in bail policy. And that seems to be what you're seeing.
Yeah, I agree. I do think that law enforcement agencies are making these hard decisions and prioritizing things all the time. And I think, the public doesn't always appreciate those hard decisions that are having to be made. And the fact that, violent crime is still low relative to historic levels. And that's likely, a result in some part to these decisions that law enforcement are making to prioritize those types of crimes.
Yeah, for sure. And I guess it's easy when law enforcement gets the finger pointed at them to say, well, it's these laws, I can't do anything, which is easier to say than, hey, we got 10 homicides, or do you want us to go after 100 people or 1,000 people that are committing petty theft?
Right.
I mean, I can sympathize a little bit with law enforcement on this issue, because I get it. They're a little frustrated that, hey, why aren't you arresting certain people committing certain crimes? And they just don't have the resources to do all of that. On the other hand, I don't think it helps the public understand what's actually going on when they throw out these false narratives.
Yeah, it's true. And, at the very extreme end, we've done work in San Francisco looking at people who are high utilizers of the criminal justice and the mental and behavioral health systems, and the physical health system, so hospitals, urgent emergent care systems. And I think there's an understanding, at least in San Francisco, that there are some people that are just cycling in and out of these systems and not getting the things that they need. And that might look like disorder on the streets, but it's really difficult, I think, for law enforcement and for the city in general to say, let's just keep arresting this person when we know that's not the answer to the things that they're dealing with. And they're not committing very serious crimes, quality of life stuff. This is low level stuff. But there needs to be a broader approach to meeting those people's needs so we can kind of take them out of this cycle. And that is a very visible form of disorder that I think people respond to, when they're thinking about how safe a place is and how safe it feels, versus very low homicide and assault rates, which maybe we see as researchers.
Yeah, and I think that gets into this idea that a lot of these people aren't making conscious decisions. They're suffering from substance use disorder. They're suffering from mental illness, and so there really isn't a calculation here. It's a lot of response and people just acting in the moment.
Yeah, definitely. And all crime to some degree has an element of randomness in it, unless it's very, very premeditated. A lot of crime, where it happens, kind of when it happens, what's going on, has an element of randomness in it where someone makes a decision or not. So to say that people are being very strategic and responding to kind of, nuanced changes in a bail policy when deciding whether or not to commit crime, to me feels like a stretch for the majority of people.
So we're almost out of time, believe it or not, but I do want to kind of summarize what we now know about bail based on your research in San Francisco and LA.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, what we found is that promoting pretrial release, safely releasing people pretrial who don't pose a threat to public safety, regardless of their ability to pay, can be done without affecting their individual recidivism rates or overall crime rates in a place. That's what I would say. It needs to be done thoughtfully and kind of on a individualized level, but the blunt approach of bail, where we just assign a dollar amount for a type of crime and anyone who's charged with that crime has to pay that dollar amount, doesn't kind of meet our societal needs for that system, which is to ensure people show up for court and that the court system functions properly and that people are able to stay out of trouble during that time. For people who need the extra support, really giving them intensive pretrial supervision, connecting them to a caseworker who can talk to them about their needs and help them get back to court seems to be a more effective way than just having people pay a dollar amount that they can't afford and sitting in detention. It also lessens the financial burden on whole communities, families and communities who have to somehow figure out how to pay that bail if they're able to, and kind of further perpetuates this cycle of concentrated disadvantage that's occurring in our communities. So I'd say we've found that it's a safe way to reduce the jail population, to release people pretrial, and with no discernible effects on public safety.
One more question. If people want to read the full study, where do they go?
Sure. So you can go to the California Policy Lab website. Is probably the easiest place to go. We have links to all of our studies in our publication page. We have a section on criminal justice studies that has a lot of information there. Our bail policy, our Los Angeles bail policy report will be there. And the San Francisco study was just published in the journal called Criminology and Public Policy. And there's a link to that on our website as well.
Great. Well, thanks for coming on. I do want to put a plug out to California Policy Lab. They do excellent research and it's much needed. We need to have objective analysis of criminal justice policies so that the public can be aware of what the impact is. And as we discussed, some of this stuff is difficult to kind of tease out. This is not definitive, let's put it that way, but it gives you an idea, which I think is better than the alternative. So thanks for coming on again and sharing your knowledge on this topic.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me and for your support. Looking forward to talking to you again.
We've been talking with Johanna Lacoe. She's the research director at the California Policy Lab. You're listening to Everyday Injustice. I'm your host, David Greenwald. Join us again next week for more tales from the injustice system.
Thank you to George Powell and Norman Mousequake Barrett for the use of our opening, Everyday Injustice. You can see more of George's music at www.justiceforgeorgepowell.com. That's Justice for George Powell, all one word, .com.